Counter-Rev Audio. April 2021. The Managerial Revolution, What is Happening in the World, by James Burnham. This edition published in 2019 by Endeavor Media Limited. Chapter 7. Who are the managers? We must now clear up a question the answer to which has so far been postponed. Who are these managers, the class which is in the process of becoming the ruling class of society? The answer which interests us will not be given in terms of individuals, that is, we do not want to know that Mr. X, Miss Y, and other separate persons are managers. The answer that we need will be, first of all, in terms of function, by virtue of what function is it that we shall designate an individual as a manager? Whoever the individual may be, now or in the future, how are we to decide whether or not he is a manager? The functions that are of initial and prime importance to us are, of course, those functions in relation to the major instruments of production, since it is the relation to the instruments of production which decides the issue of class dominance, of power and privilege, in society. The first part of the answer might seem to be only a verbal juggle and of no more value than any other verbal juggle. The managers are simply those who are, in fact, managing the instruments of production nowadays. Certainly, saying this does not appreciably advance our understanding. We must, therefore, investigate more carefully to see just who is doing the managing, and, in the investigation, we shall have to analyze out several ideas which are confusedly grouped together under the concept of management. It would seem obvious that in capitalist society it would be the capitalists who, in decisive respects at least, do the managing. If they do not manage the instruments of production, how could they maintain their position as ruling class, which depends upon control over the instruments of production? This is obvious, and the answer to this question is that they could not. It is the fact that during the past several decades the de facto management of the instruments of production has to a constantly increasing extent got out of the hands of the capitalists that so plainly proves society to be shifting away from capitalism and the capitalists losing their status as the ruling class. In ever-widening sectors of world economy, the actual managers are not the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, or, at the very least, the managerial prerogatives of the capitalists are being progressively whittled down. The completion of this process means the elimination of the capitalists from control over the economy, that is, their disappearance as a ruling class. Let us make some distinctions. It is unnecessary to stress that the most important branches of modern industry are highly complex in technical organization. The tools, machines, and procedures involved are the results of highly developed scientific and technical operations. The division of labor is minute and myriad, and the turning out of the final product is possible only through the technical coordination of a vast number of separate tasks, not only within the individual factory, but in mines, farms, railroads, steamships, affiliated processors, and the like. If we continue to look purely at the technical side of the process, we may observe the following. In comparison with the organization of industry in the period prior to modern mass production, the individual tasks, with the notable exception of a comparatively small percentage, require relatively less skill and training on the part of the individual worker. A century ago it took many years and considerable native aptitude to make a skilled general mechanic of the kind who then made engines or buildings or carriages or tools or machines. Today it takes a couple of weeks to make a worker ready to take his full place on a production or assembly line. Even so-called skilled work today usually needs no more than a few months' training. But, conversely, at the same time today a small percentage of tasks requires very great training and skill. Or let me put it in this way, within the process of production, the gap, estimated both in amount of skill and training and in difference of type of function, between the average worker and those who are in charge, on the technical side, of the process of production is far greater today than in the past. From among those tasks which, today, require lengthy training and considerable skill, three may be separated out. One type is found widely in those industries which, like the building industry, have not yet been organized in accordance with modern methods. There is, however, no technical reason why this has not been done in such industries. If it were done, the relative number of highly skilled workers in, for example, building would at once enormously decrease. Another type consists of those tasks which need elaborate training in the physical sciences and in engineering. These have greatly increased in recent decades. A century ago, there were scarcely any highly trained chemists, physicists, biochemists, or even engineers functioning directly in industry, a fact which is plainly witnessed by the almost complete lack of educational facilities for training such industrial scientists and engineers. The comparatively primitive techniques of those days did not require such persons. Today few branches of industry could operate without their constant services. The third type consists of the tasks of the technical direction and coordination of the process of production. All the necessary workers, skilled and unskilled, and all the industrial scientists will not turn out automobiles. The diverse tasks must be organized, coordinated, so that the different materials, tools, machines, plants, workers are all available at the proper place and moment and in the proper numbers. This task of direction and coordination is itself a highly specialized function. Often it, also, requires acquaintance with the physical sciences, or the psychological and social sciences, since human beings are not the least among the instruments of production, and with engineering. But it is a mistake, which was made by Veblen, among others, to confuse this directing and coordinating function with the scientific and engineering work which I have listed under the second type of task. After all, the engineers and scientists of the second type are merely highly skilled workers, no different in kind from the worker whose developed skill enables him to make a precision tool or operate an ingenious lathe. They have no functions of guiding, administering, managing, organizing the process of production, which tasks are the distinctive mark of the third type. For these tasks, engineering and scientific knowledge may be, though it is not always, or necessarily, a qualification, but the tasks themselves are not engineering or science in the usual sense. It is this third type of function which, in the fullest and clearest meaning, I call managing, and those who carry out this type of function are they whom I call the managers. Many different names are given them. We may often recognize them as production managers, operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers, supervisory technicians, or, in government, for they are to be found in governmental enterprise just as in private enterprise, as administrators, commissioners, bureau heads, and so on. I mean by managers, in short, those who already for the most part in contemporary society are actually managing, on its technical side, the actual process of production, no matter what the legal and financial form, individual, corporate, governmental, of the process. There are, to be sure, gradations among the managers. Under the chief operating executives of a corporation like General Motors or U.S. Steel or a state enterprise like the TVA there are dozens and hundreds of lesser managers, a whole hierarchy of them. In its broader sense the class of managers includes them all, within the class there are the lesser and the greater. But, it may well be commented, there is nothing new in the existence of managers. Industry has always had to have managers. Why do they suddenly assume this peculiar importance? Let us examine this comment. In the first place, industry did not always require managers, at the very least not at all in the sense that we find them today. In feudal times the individual serf and his family tilled the small plot of soil to which he was attached, the individual artisan with his own tools turned out his finished product. No manager intervened to regulate and organize the process of production. Managers entered in only to the negligible sector of economy where larger-scale enterprise was employed. Even in earlier capitalist times, the function of technical management was not crucial. The process of production was so simple, the division of labor so little developed compared to today, that hardly any special skill and training were necessary to carry out the functions of management. Nearly anyone who had any reasonable acquaintance with the industry in question could handle them. Equally decisive for our purpose is the differentiation in who does the managing, what prerogatives attach to management, and how the functions of management are related to other economic and social functions. In the earlier days of capitalism, the typical capitalist, the ideal of the ideologist before and after Adam Smith, was himself his own manager so far as there were managerial functions other than those assigned to some reliable skilled worker in the shop. He was the individual entrepreneur, who owned the whole or the greater share of a factory or mine or shop or steamship company or whatever it might be, and actively managed his own enterprise, perhaps to retire in old age in favor of management by his heirs. But, as is well known, the growth of large-scale public corporations along with the technological development of modern industry have virtually wiped such types of enterprise out of the important sections of the economy, with a few exceptions, they remain only among the small businesses which are trivial in their historical influence. These changes have meant that to an ever-growing extent the managers are no longer, either as individuals or legally or historically, the same as the capitalists. There is a combined shift. Through changes in the technique of production, the functions of management become more distinctive, more complex, more specialized, and more crucial to the whole process of production, thus serving to set off those who perform these functions as a separate group or class in society, and at the same time those who formerly carried out what functions there were of management, the bourgeoisie, themselves withdraw from management, so that the difference in function becomes also a difference in the individuals who carry out the function. Let us take a hypothetical and oversimplified example in order to make more precise what is meant by management and to separate this off from other ideas which are often grouped with it. We will let our example be an imaginary automobile company. In connection with the ownership, control, and management situation in relation to this company, we may distinguish the following four groups. 1. Certain individuals, the operating executives, production managers, plant superintendents, and their associates, have charge of the actual technical process of producing. It is their job to organize the materials, tools, machines, plant facilities, equipment, and labor in such a way as to turn out the automobiles. These are the individuals whom I call the managers. It should be observed that the area of production which any group of them manages is most variable. It may be a single small factory or mine or a single department within a factory. Or it may be a large number of factories, mines, railroads, and so on, as in the case of the chief managers of the great United States corporations. In theory, the area could be extended to cover an entire interrelated branch of industry, automobiles, mines, utilities, railroads, whatever it might be, or most, or even all, of the entire mechanism of production. In practice in the United States at present, however, there do not exist managers in this sense for whole branches of industry, with possibly one or two exceptions, much less for a major portion or all of industry as a whole. The organization and coordination of industry as a whole is carried on through the instrumentality of the market, without deliberate and explicit management exercised by specific managers, or indeed, by anyone else. 2. Certain individuals, among whom, in the United States at present, would ordinarily be found the highest ranked and best paid of the company officials, have the functions of guiding the company toward a profit, of selling the automobiles at a price and in the most suitable numbers for yielding a profit, of bargaining over prices paid for raw materials and labor, of arranging the terms of the financing of the company, and so on. These functions are often also called those of management and those who fulfill them, managers. However, there is clearly no necessary connection between them and the first type of function. From the point of view of the technical process of production, a car would be neither worse nor better because of what it sold for. It could be given away and still be the same car, technically speaking, or what the materials which went into it cost, nor, so far as technical problems go, does the difference between bank loans at 4% or 5% show up in the power of the motor, or a change in dividend rate alter the strength of the frame. In order to distinguish this group from the first, I shall call the individuals who make it up finance executives or simply executives, reserving the terms management and managers for the first group only. 3. Certain individuals, among whom in the United States at present would be many of the directors of the company and more particularly the bankers and big financiers who actually appoint the directors, have problems different from either of the first types. Their direct concern is not, or need not be, either the technical process of production or even the profit of the particular company. Through holding companies, interlocking directorates, banks, and other devices, they are interested in the financial aspects not merely of this automobile company but of many other companies and many market operations. They may wish to unite this company with others, in order perhaps to sell a stock or bond issue to the public, independently of the effect of the merger on the technical process of production or on the profits of our original company. They may want, for tax or speculative or other reasons, to lower the profit of this company, and could do so by, for example, raising prices charged by supply companies which they also were interested in. They may want to put some competitors out of business or influence politics or inflate prices, and any of such aims might be altogether independent of the requirements of production or profit in the particular automobile company. Any number of variants is possible. I shall call this third group the finance capitalists. 4. Finally, there are certain individuals, a comparatively large number as a rule in the United States at present, who own in their name stock certificates in the automobile company and who are formally and legally the owners of our company. In fact, however, the great bulk of them, comprising in sum the legal owners of the substantial majority of the stock of the company, have an entirely passive relation to the company. The only right they possess with reference to the company is to receive, as against those who do not have stock certificates registered in their names, money in the form of dividends when on occasion dividends are declared by the directors. This fourfold separation into managers, executives, finance capitalists, and stockholders is, in reality, a separation of function, of four of the types of relation in which it is possible to stand toward a certain section of the instruments of production. It is theoretically possible, therefore, that one and the same individual, or one and the same group of individuals, should perform all four of these functions, should stand in all four of these relations to the instruments of production in question, in our hypothetical case, the tangible assets of the automobile company. That is, one and the same individual, Henry Ford, as of some years ago, was a late and favored example, or group of individuals could manage the production of the company, direct its policy so as to make a profit, integrate its activities in relation to banks and to other companies, if such were in question, and be the sole stockholder of the company. Not only is such an identity possible, until comparatively recently, it was normally the case. Today, however, it is very seldom the case, especially in the more important sections of industry. The four functions are much more sharply differentiated than in the past, and they are, as a rule, performed by different sets of persons. It is not always so, of course, but it tends to become more and more so. Even where there is overlapping, where the same individual performs several of these functions, his activities in pursuit of each are easily separable. Two further facts about these groups may be noted: in most large corporations, which together are decisive in the economy, the bulk of the stockholders, holding in their names the majority of the shares of stock, have, as everyone knows, the passive relation to the company which has been referred to. With only the rarest exceptions, they exercise no real control over the company except for the minor element of control involved in their preferential sharing, as against non-stockholders, in the profits, or rather the declared dividends, of the company. But the third group in our list, the finance capitalists, are also, some of them at any rate, stockholders. Together they usually do not own in the legal sense a majority of the shares, but they ordinarily own a substantial block of the shares, and have at their disposal liquid funds and other resources whereby they can, when need arises, obtain from the small stockholders enough proxies on stock shares to be able to vote a majority. Thus this third group is in a legal position of ownership toward the company and the instruments of production included among the company's assets, if not with the unambiguous title of an earlier capitalist, who in his own name owned all, or a majority of, the shares of a company, at least to a sufficient degree to preserve the meaning of the legal relationship. Sometimes the executives of Group 2 are also included in Group 4 and have substantial legal interests of ownership in the company, that is, have registered in their own or their family's name substantial blocks of the company's stock. But this is very seldom the case with the managers proper. With the members of Group 1, these ordinarily have no legal ownership interest in the company, or at most a very small interest, that is, they are not usually large stockholders in the company. Second, there is a complete difference among these groups with respect to the technical role of their respective functions in relation to the process of production. The process of production is technically and literally impossible unless someone is carrying out the functions of management, of Group 1, not necessarily the same individuals who carry them out today, but, at any rate, someone. Some of the finance executive functions comprised in Group 2 are also technically necessary to the process of production, though not necessarily in the same sense as today, that is, not necessarily, from a technical point of view, for the sake of profit as understood by capitalism. There must be some regulation of the quality, kinds, numbers, and distribution of products apart from the theoretic abilities of the instruments of production to turn products out. This regulation would not have to be achieved, however, as it is through the finance executives, in terms of capitalist profits for the company. It could be done in subordination to some political or social or psychological aim, war or a higher standard of mass living or prestige and glory or the maintenance of some particular power relationship. In fact, with profit in the capitalist sense eliminated, the technically necessary functions of the finance executives of Group 2 become part of the management functions of Group 1, if management is extended over all or most of industry. Management could, that is to say, absorb all of the technically necessary functions of the non-managing executives. But, still from a strictly technical viewpoint, the remaining functions, the profit-making functions, of Group 2 and all the functions of Groups 3 and 4, finance capitalist and stockholder, are altogether unnecessary, whether or not desirable from some other point of view, to the process of production. So far as the technical process of production goes, there need not be finance capitalists or stockholders, and the executives of Group 2, stripped of many of their present functions, can be merged in the management Group 1. 1. Not only is this development conceivable, it has already been almost entirely achieved in Russia, is approached more and more nearly in Germany, and has gone a considerable distance in all other nations. In the United States, as everywhere, it is precisely the situation to be found throughout state enterprise. This development is a decisive phase of the managerial revolution. The so-called separation of ownership and control, paralleling the growth of the great public corporations of modern times, has, of course, been a widely recognized phenomenon. A decade ago it was the principal subject of the widely read book, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, by Burl and Means. In this book, the authors showed that the economy of the United States was dominated by the 200 largest non-banking corporations. They did not discuss the relations of these to financial houses, and, second, that the majority of these corporations were no longer, in practice, controlled by their nominal legal owners, that is, stockholders holding in their names a majority of the shares of stock. They divided these corporations according to types of control. In a few, control was exercised by a single individual, more often, single family, who was legal owner of all or a majority of the stock. In others, by individuals or groups which owned not a majority but a substantial percentage of the stock. Most, however, in 1929, 65% of these 200 corporations with 80% of the total assets, they decided were what they called, significantly enough, management-controlled. By management-controlled, as they explained, they meant that the management, executives, of these companies, though owning only minor percentages of the shares of their corporations, were in actuality self-perpetuating, in control of the policies and the boards of directors of the companies and able to manipulate at will, through proxies, majority votes of the nominal owners, the shareholders. The American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation is the classic example of management control. Though briefly, Burl and Means also took up the extremely important point that in the nature of the case there were sources of frequent conflict between the interests of the control group, most often, the management, and the legal owners. This is apparent enough to anyone who recalls the economic events of the past generation. Many books have been written about the difficulties of the run-of-the-mine common stockholders, often as a result of the policies of the control group of their own company. Wealth, power, and even other possible interests, such as maximum industrial efficiency, of the control group quite naturally do not often coincide with maximum dividends and security for the common stockholders. The analysis by Burl and Means is most suggestive and indirectly a powerful confirmation of the theory of the managerial revolution, but as it stands it is not carried far enough for our purposes. In their concept of management control they do not distinguish between management in the sense of actual direction of the process of production, the sense of our Group 1 and the only sense in which we refer to management, and management in terms of profit, selling, financing, and so on, our Group 2, the finance executives. Indeed, their use of management, as is usually the case, is closer to the latter than the former, which results really from the fact that in most big corporations today the chief and best-known officials are of the second or executive, not of the first or manager, type. Moreover, Burl and Means do not include any study of the way in which their supposedly self-perpetuating and autonomous managements are in actuality often controlled by big banks or groups of financiers, our Group 3. One result of such a refinement and amplification of the Burl and Means analysis would be to show that the sources of possible and actual conflict among the groups are far more numerous and more acute than they indicate. Among these sources, 3 should be stressed. 1. It is a historical law, with no apparent exceptions so far known, that all social or economic groups of any size strive to improve their relative position with respect to power and privilege in society. This law certainly applies to the four groups into which we have divided those who stand in some sort of relation of ownership, management, or control toward the instruments of production. Each of these groups seeks to improve its position of power and privilege. But, in practice, an improvement in the position of one of them is not only not necessarily an improvement for the others, often it means a worsening of the position of one or all of the others. In periods of great prosperity and expansion, this is not very irritating, since all four can advance relatively as against the rest of society, but, as we have already seen, such periods have ended for capitalism. In conditions which are now normal, an increase in income for the managers or even the executives of Group 2 means so much the less for Group 3, the financiers, and Group 4, the stockholders. Even more apparently, the relations of control over the operations of the instruments of production raise conflicts, since the sort of operation most favorable to one group, expanding or contracting production, for example, very often is not that most favorable to another. And, in general, there is a source of permanent conflict. The managers proper receive far less reward, money, than the executives and especially the finance capitalists, who get by far the greatest benefits. From the point of view of the manager group, especially as economic conditions progressively decay, the reward allotted to the finance capitalists seems inordinate and unjustified, all the more so because, as the managers see it more and more clearly, the finance capitalists are not performing any function necessary to the process of production. 2. All four of these groups, to one or another degree, are powerful and privileged as against the great masses of the population, who have no interest of ownership, management, or control in the instruments of production and no special preferential treatment in the distribution of their products. Consequently, the masses have a tendency to strive for a greater share of power and privilege as against all four of these groups. The result of this situation might be expected to be a merging of the conflicts among the four groups and a common front against the pressure of the masses. This has indeed been often the case. Nevertheless, the conflicts among the groups are real and cannot be eliminated even in the face of a common danger. In fact, the presence of the common danger is itself a source of new conflicts. This follows because the groups, from the very status they occupy and functions they fulfill, favor different methods of meeting the danger and of maintaining privilege as against the masses. The differences become sharpened under the crisis conditions of contemporary capitalism. This can be made clear by a single example. The position, role, and function of the managers are in no way dependent upon the maintenance of capitalist property and economic relations, even if many of the managers themselves think so. They depend upon the technical nature of the process of modern production. Consequently, the preservation of the capitalist relations is not an absolutely decisive question for the managers. The position, role, and function of the most privileged of all the groups, the finance capitalists, are, however, entirely bound up with capitalist property and economic relations, and their preservation is decisive for even the continued existence of this group. This holds in general and cannot help affecting the situation with respect to more specific problems. For instance, from the point of view of the technical position of the managers, the problem of unemployment is perfectly easy to solve. If the technical coordination and integration of industry were extended, unemployment could be wiped out in a month. Moreover, the managers, or many of them, are aware that unless mass unemployment is wiped out, all privileges, including their own, will be wiped out, either through national defeat by a nation which has wiped it out or by internal chaos. But mass unemployment cannot be eliminated without invading and finally abolishing capitalist property and economic relations. The position of the managers thus forces them toward solutions which would have such an effect. But the finance capitalists, and even the executives, for that matter, are differently situated. Their position, depending on the capitalist relations, thereby depends also on the continuance of mass unemployment. They cannot entertain any solution that has a chance of eliminating unemployment without involving at the same time their own elimination. If they think they can, they are simply mistaken, as they are beginning to find out in Germany and will before long find out elsewhere. 3. A third source of conflict is found in what we might call occupational bias, a point to which we shall return later. The different things which these different groups do promote in their respective members' different attitudes, habits of thought, ideals, ways and methods of solving problems. To put it crudely, the managers tend to think of solving social and political problems as they coordinate and organize the actual process of production. The non-managerial executives think of society as a price-governed profit-making animal. The finance capitalists think of problems in terms of what happens in banks and stock exchanges and security flotations. The little stockholders think of the economy as a mysterious god who, if placated properly, will hand out free gifts to the deserving. But there is a more basic deficiency in the analysis of Burrell and Means or any similar analysis. The truth is that, whatever its legal merits, the concept of the separation of ownership and control has no sociological or historical meaning. Ownership means control. If there is no control, then there is no ownership. The central aspects of the control, which is ownership, are, as we have seen, control over access to the object in question and preferential treatment in the distribution of its products. If ownership and control are in reality separated, then ownership has changed hands to the control, and the separated ownership is a meaningless fiction. This is perfectly obvious as soon as we think about it. If I own a house, let us say, that means that, at least under normal circumstances, I can prevent others from entering it. In developed societies with political institutions, it means also that the state, the police in this instance, backed by the courts, will if necessary enforce this control of mine over access to the house. If I cannot, when I wish to, prevent others from entering the house, if anyone else or everyone has the same rights of entry as I, then neither I nor anyone would say that I am the owner of the house. I can, of course, alienate my control, either temporarily, through a lease, or permanently, through sale or gift, but these and similar acts do not alter the fundamental point. Moreover, insofar as there are products of the house, warmth, shelter, privacy might be so considered, as well as rent, I, as owner, am, by the very fact of control over access in this case, entitled to preferential treatment in receiving these products. Where the object owned takes the form of instruments of production, factories, machines, mines, railroads, the situation is the same, only more complicated. For sociological and practical purposes, the owner, or owners, of the instruments of production is the one, or group, that in fact, whether or not in theory and words, controls access to those instruments and controls preferential treatment in the distribution of their products. These two rights, control of access and preferential treatment in distribution, are fundamental in ownership and, as we have noted, determine the dominant or ruling class in society, which consists simply of the group that has those rights, or has them, at least, in greater measure than the rest of society, with respect to the chief instruments of production. Moreover, historical experience shows, as would be obvious without much experience, that these two rights are interrelated and that the first, control of access, is determinative of the second. That is to say, the group or groups which have control over access to the instruments of production will, as a matter of experienced fact, also receive preference in the distribution of the products of those instruments. Or in other words, the most powerful, in terms of economic relations, will also be the wealthiest. This does not apply to every separate individual concerned, and there may be a temporary dislocation in the relationship, but to groups, and over any period of time beyond a comparatively few years, it seems to apply always. Social groups and classes are, we might say, selfish. They use their control to benefit primarily, not necessarily exclusively, themselves. Burrell and Means are therefore inconsistent, or at least incomplete, when they speak of the separation of ownership and control. Those who control are the owners. The fact is that all four groups we have dealt with share at least to some degree in control, at the least they all control preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of the instruments of production, which is enough to constitute them owners, though in the case of the bulk of the stockholders, who have this control to a minor extent and none of the more decisive control over access, the ownership is of a very subordinate kind. But if we reinterpret the phrase separation of ownership and control to mean separation of control over access from control over preferential treatment and distribution, and this is partly what lies back of the Burrell and Means analysis, then we are confronted with a fact of primary importance. It is true that a partial separation of this kind has been taking place during recent decades. Income and power have become unbalanced. Those who receive the most preferential treatment in distribution, get the biggest relative share of the national income, have, in differing degrees in different nations and different sections of the economy, been losing control over access. Others, who do not receive such a measure in preferential treatment and distribution, have been gaining in the measure of control over access which they exercise. Historical experience tells us that such a lack of correlation between the two kinds of control, the two basic rights of property, cannot long endure. Control over access is decisive, and, when consolidated, will carry control over preferential treatment and distribution with it, that is, will shift ownership unambiguously to the new controlling, a new dominant, class. Here we see, from a new viewpoint, the mechanism of the managerial revolution. Chapter 8. The managers move toward social dominance. The contention of the last chapter that control over the instruments of production is everywhere undergoing a shift, away from the capitalists proper and toward the managers, will seem to many fantastic and naive, especially if we are thinking in the first instance of the United States. Consider, it will be argued, the growth of monopoly in our time. Think of the 60 families, with their billions upon billions of wealth, their millions of shares of stock in the greatest corporations, and their lives which exceed in luxury and display anything even dreamed of by the rulers of past ages. The managers, even the chief of them, are only the servants, the bailiffs of the 60 families. How absurd to call the servant, master. Such would have been the comment, except, perhaps, of a few small towns, Florence, Genoa, Venice, Bruges, Augsburg, if anyone had in the early 15th century been so much a dreamer as to suggest that control was then shifting from the feudal lords toward the small, dull, vulgar group of merchants and traders and moneylenders. Consider, it would have been argued, the splendid, insolent dukes and barons and princes, with their shining armor and their castles and clouds of retainers, and the land, all the land, in their grasp. Merchants, moneylenders. They are only purveyors to the mighty, fit to provide them with the luxuries required by their station and occasionally to lend them a few despised ducats for provisioning an army or building a new fortress. Yet, only a century thereafter, and change is more rapid now, the social heirs of those merchants and traders and moneylenders were, with their ducats, deciding the succession to thrones, the elections of emperors and popes, the winning of wars, the signing of peace. Within a century their social domination, though not yet consolidated, was assured. Yes, even the broad lands of the barons were passing into their hands as mortgages were foreclosed or as desperate lords strove hopelessly for the money they did not have and without which in the new age they could not even feed their children. We must not anticipate. A process which is in mid-course is not finished. The big bourgeoisie, the finance capitalists, are still the ruling class in the United States, the final control is still in their hands. But we must not view the world too narrowly nor limit our eyes to the surface. For it is a world process with which we are dealing, since capitalism is a world system, the United States is linked economically, socially, culturally, and, most dramatically of all, how well we know this today, strategically with all the world. And the process goes all the way to the roots of society, it does not remain merely on the outer layers. If we lift our eyes to the world arena and sink them to the roots, we will see what is there, that the capitalists, the ruling class of modern society, are losing control, that the social structure which placed them in the position of ruling class is being transformed, not tomorrow, but now, as we watch. In the new structure, when its foundations are completed, there will be no capitalists. We have seen that the rise to power and domination of the bourgeoisie meant, first of all, the progressive reduction of greater and greater percentages of the instruments of production to capitalist economic relations, that is, control by and in the primary interests of the capitalists instead of the feudal ruling class. This increase of percentage meant either putting on a capitalist basis areas of production which had been on a feudal basis, or, equally well, opening up, along capitalist lines, areas of production which had not existed under feudalism. Either development was an increase in the total percentage of production under capitalist control. There was still another variable, though more difficult to measure, in this process of the extension of capitalist control, namely, the degree to which a given section of production was subject to capitalist relations. For example, so long as feudal lords, making use of the church doctrine against usury, could repudiate loans and refuse to honor pledges they had made on loans, and get away with it, The business of loaning was not fully capitalist in character, or, similarly, with guild and serf restrictions interfering with the wage relation between capitalist and worker, or feudal just price conceptions blocking free exchange of commodities on the market, etc. The extension of capitalist control was also indicated by the progressive overcoming of all such restrictions on the capitalist mode of economy. We have also seen that, from one point of view, within the economic sphere the extension of capitalist control went on steadily and continuously, with scarcely an interruption. From the latter part of the Middle Ages on, virtually every decade found a higher percentage of the economy capitalist than had been the case during the preceding decade. Individual capitalists were wiped out, true enough, either by other capitalists, or often by feudal lords. Nearly every great financier was ruined in the state bankruptcies of the latter part of the 16th century, for example. We are not, however, concerned with the fate of individual members of a class. The capitalists who were wiped out were not replaced by feudal lords or officials but by other capitalists. At certain times, moreover, the extension of capitalist control was not slow and steady but sudden and large-scale. These times were in conjunction with wars, international, colonial, and civil. As the economic historian of the Renaissance, Richard Ehrenberg, puts it, political effects tend to be catastrophic, as opposed to the slow, almost imperceptible action of economic forces and interests. The turning point in capitalist control over the economy was reached during the First World War. This is why I selected the date, 1914, as that of the beginning of the social transition from capitalist to managerial society. The curve of the extension of capitalist control, which had risen without interruption from the 14th century, abruptly broke downward and has sunk continuously ever since, heading swiftly toward zero. When once it is brought to our attention and when we think of it in terms of the world arena, this shift in control over the instruments of production away from the big capitalists, which has gone on since the beginning of the First World War, cannot possibly be denied, even from the most obvious point of view. All of Russia, 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, was taken out of capitalist hands during the course of the war. In Italy and especially in Germany, because of its advanced technology and equipment far more decisive than Russia, and in what Germany conquers, capitalist control is plainly headed toward extinction. Russia and Germany will, however, occupy us in some detail later. In the present chapter, let us consider the situation in the United States itself, where the process with which we are dealing has gone a shorter distance than in any other major nation. Insofar as the United States is capitalist, this means that control over the instruments of production is held by those who have capitalist property rights in those instruments. Historically and legally in the United States, this, in turn, means, above all, the few hundred great families, the 60 families, as Ferdinand Lundberg called the chief of them in his book which took its title from that phrase, who, in point of fact, have in the form of stock and other ownership certificates much greater legal capitalist ownership rights than any other group. There can be no question today about the control over preferential treatment and distribution which is possessed by these families. The funds available to them are colossal in relation to their small numbers. In spite of much that is written and said on the subject, probably few outside their ranks really comprehend the scale of luxury on which many of them live, a scale exceeding anything known before in history. Nevertheless, we have seen that of the two decisive elements in actual ownership, control over preferential treatment and distribution is subordinate to control over access. With respect to the latter, though it is by no means yet out of the hands of the big bourgeoisie, though it can still be exercised by them on crucial occasions, it has on the whole been diminishing during the past generation. This is indicated in one very interesting and important way by a phenomenon which might be called the withdrawal of the big bourgeoisie from production. The big capitalists, legally the chief owners of the instruments of production, have in actual life been getting further and further away from those instruments, which are the final source and base of social dominance. This began some time ago, when most of the big capitalists withdrew from industrial production to finance. At first this shift to finance, which was well underway by the turn of this century, did not mean any lessening of control over the instruments of production, rather the contrary, for through finance capitalist methods a wider area than ever of the economy was brought, and was brought more stringently, under the control of the big capitalists. Nevertheless, the control necessarily became more indirect, exercised at second or third or fourth hand through financial devices. Direct supervision of the productive process was delegated to others, who, particularly with the parallel development of modern mass production methods, had to assume more and more of the prerogatives of control, for example, the all-important prerogative of hiring and firing, the very heart of control over access to the instruments of production, as well as organization of the technical process of production. But the big capitalists did not stop their withdrawal at the level of finance. We find that they have more and more withdrawn, not merely from production proper, but from active and direct participation of any sort in the economic process. They spend their time, not in industry or even in finance, but on yachts and beaches, in casinos and traveling among their many estates, or, others of them, in charitable, educational, or even artistic activities. Statistics on such a point are difficult to get, but it is safe to say that a substantial majority of the members of the first 60 families listed by Lundberg has withdrawn from any serious direct active contact with the economic process. To rule society, let it be remembered, is a full-time job. The point is emphasized by reflecting how much, it is often estimated at more than a half, of the wealth and legal ownership possessed by the big capitalists is now registered in the name of women. Such registration is often a legal device to aid in the preservation of the wealth, but it marks again the gap between the legal owners, in the capitalist sense, and the instruments of production, whatever the biological merits. It is a fact that women do not play a serious leading role in the actual economic process. We are not interested in the moral side of this withdrawal of the big capitalist families. Differing moral criteria can be found to label their lives today as either more wasteful and parasitic or more enlightened than those of their predecessors. What interests us are the social implications, now and for the future, of this withdrawal. One consequence of the withdrawal is necessarily the assumption of more and more power over the actual processes of production, more and more of the time, by others than the chief legal owners of the instruments of production, in many instances by those whom we call the managers. It could not be otherwise. Somebody is going to do the actual managing, and, the way things have happened, as the big capitalists do less of it, the managers have been doing more. Of course, as the situation still is in the United States, the power of the managers is still far from absolute, is still in the last analysis subordinate to that of the big capitalists. The big capitalists and the institutional relations of capitalism continue to provide a framework within which the managers must work, for example, in determining the raising or lowering of production output, the large-scale financial operations, the connections between different units of industry, and so on. The big capitalists intervene at occasional key moments that affect the broad directions of major policies. They keep, as a rule, a kind of veto right which can be enforced when necessary by, for example, getting rid of any rebellious managers. The managers remain in considerable measure delegates, servants, of the big capitalists. Such a delegation of power and control is, however, highly unstable. It has always happened that servants who discover themselves to be solidly enough established gradually turn on their masters, especially if they wake up to the fact that their masters are no longer necessary to them. Under the Merovingian kings of France in the Dark Ages, the mayor of the palace was originally the mere vulgar chief of the court servants. Gradually the actual control of administration got into the hands of the mayors of the palace. But, for several generations thereafter, the Merovingians, becoming more and more mere puppets, were kept as kings and lived with all the outward signs of kingship. The final act of doing away with them, which took place when the mayor who was the father of Charlemagne proclaimed himself king, simply put in a formal way what had already happened in sociological reality. The instruments of production are the seat of social domination. Who controls them, in fact not in name, controls society, for they are the means whereby society lives. The fact today is that the control of the big capitalists, the control based upon capitalist private property rights, over the instruments of production and their operation is, though still real, growingly tenuous, indirect, intermittent. More and more of the time, over more and more phases of the productive process, no capitalist intervention appears. In another transition age, feudal lords, on harsh enough terms, leased out towns or lands to capitalists, who conducted capitalist operations with them in place of the feudal operations which the lords had before then directed. The lords remained lords and lived like lords. They had, seemingly, controlling rights, could throw out the capitalists at will and bleed them for even more returns than the contracts called for. But, somehow, after a while, it was the capitalists who had the town and the land and the industry, and the lord who was left with a long ancestry and noble titles, and an empty purse and vanished power. Throughout industry, de facto control by the managers over the actual processes of production is rapidly growing in terms both of the aspects of production to which it extends and the times in which it is exercised. In some sections of the economy, the managerial control is already fairly thorough, even though always limited indirectly by big capitalist control of the banks and finance. Though the Burnham conception of management-controlled corporations fails, as we have seen, to clarify what is meant by management and how management is related to finance, yet there are many corporations, and these from among the greatest, not the secondary, where the managers in our sense are quite firmly entrenched, where owners, in the legal and historical capitalist meaning, have scarcely anything to do with the corporations beyond drawing dividends when the managers grant them. But it might be asked, assuming that this development is taking place, does it not mean simply that the old big bourgeois families are on their way out of the front rank and new persons are about to take their places? This has happened many times before during the history of capitalism. The survival of capitalism, as we have seen, does not depend upon the survival of any given individual capitalists but of a ruling capitalist class, upon the fact that the social place of any individual capitalists who are eliminated is taken by other capitalists. This was what happened before, and outstandingly in the United States. If the old and wealthiest capitalists are slipping, then, it would seem, the newer managers will utilize their growing power to become the new members of the big bourgeoisie. However, in spite of the fact that many of the managers doubtless have such an aim as their personal motivation, it will not happen. In the first place, with the rarest exceptions, it is no longer possible for the managers to realize such an aim, even if they have it. The chance to build up vast aggregates of wealth of the kind held by the big bourgeois families no longer exists under the conditions of contemporary capitalism. Lundberg shows that since the end of the First World War there has been only a single change in the listing of the first 60 families in this country, only a single newcomer has penetrated that stratum, and this closing of the doors to the top rank occurred much later in the United States than in the other great capitalist nations. The inability of a ruling class to assimilate fresh and vigorous new blood into its ranks is correctly recognized by many sociologists as an important symptom of the decadence of that class and its approaching downfall. In addition, however, because of the structural changes within society, the future road toward social domination and control no longer lies in the massing of personally held capitalist property rights. Not merely is getting these rights on a big scale nearly impossible for newcomers, but also, if the aim is greater social domination and privilege, there are now and for the future more effective means for achieving the aim. With capitalism extending and ascendant, individual capitalists, together making up the ruling class, are, when they disappear, replaced by other individual capitalists. With capitalism collapsing and on its way out, the ruling capitalist class as a whole is being replaced by a new ruling class. This need not mean, though it may, that those same individuals who are at present managers under capitalism will constitute that new ruling managerial class of the future. Very few of the leading capitalist families of the 16th century survived to become part of the ruling capitalist class of later generations. If the present managers do not themselves constitute the new ruling class, then other individuals will. But the other individuals will do so by themselves becoming managers, not capitalists, because the new ruling class will be the managerial class. So far we have been considering the weakening of control by the big bourgeoisie and the increase of control by others, in particular the managers, within the field of what is usually called private enterprise, the field of capitalist economy proper. The process is strictly analogous to what happened in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, in a constantly growing section of the total economy. Control by the previously established ruling class diminishes, and control by another class is extended. The somewhat blurred outlines of the picture so far drawn are at once sharpened when we extend our view from private to governmental, state, enterprise. The rapidity with which the economy is being removed from control by capitalists, that is, from organization in terms of capitalist economic relations, is unmistakable as soon as we pay attention to the role of government. Here, too, the example of the United States is all the more remarkable because in this country the development has gone much less far than anywhere else. In capitalist society, the role of government in the economy is always secondary. The government acts in the economy chiefly to preserve the integrity of the market and of capitalist property relations, and to give aid and comfort, as in wars or international competition or internal disturbances, where these are needed. This we have noted in describing the general features of capitalist society. This restriction in the government's sphere of activity, whatever the form of the government, dictatorial or democratic, in the political sphere, is not a coincidence, but, it must be stressed again, an integral part of the whole social structure of capitalism. Capitalist economy is a system of private ownership of a certain type vested in private individuals, of private enterprise. The capitalist state is therefore, and necessarily, a limited state. The traditional and necessary capitalist role of government is, as everyone knows, now being quickly abandoned in all nations, has been altogether abandoned in at least one, Russia, and close to abandoned in several others. Government is moving always more widely into the economy. No matter who runs the government or for what, every new incursion of government into the economy means that one more section of the economy is wholly or partially removed from the reign of capitalist economic relations. That this is the meaning of the governmental extensions into the economy can be seen from one very simple and obvious fact alone: all capitalist enterprises are run for profit. If, over a period, they do not make a profit, they have to stop running. But governments not only do not have to make a profit but on the contrary normally and properly run in the contemporary world at what is from the capitalist point of view a loss. When governments confine themselves to the narrower political sphere, army, police, courts, diplomacy, this might not have seemed so out of line, though in those days governments ran continuously at a loss only at the cost of going bankrupt. Like any other capitalist institution, it could be thought that the government was a special expense chargeable to business like the private police force of a steel mill or the public relations department of a utilities firm. But when we remember that government is now the biggest business of all, in the strictly economic as well as in other spheres, the demonstrated ability of government to keep running at a loss is intolerable from the standpoint of capitalism, and shows that the government functioning in the economy is implicitly a non-capitalist institution. The government extension into the economy is of two kinds. First, government takes over fully, with all attributes of ownership, section after section of the economy, both by acquiring already established sections and by opening up other sections not previously existing. There is little need to give examples: postal service, transportation, water supply, utilities, bridges, shipbuilding, sanitation, communications, housing, become fields of government enterprise. Among new fields that are opened up by government are such vast potential areas as what this country calls conservation work, in order to hide the fact that it is a necessary part of contemporary economy. What must be stressed is how much greater the area of government enterprise already is, even in the United States, than we commonly wish to recognize. It doesn't make any difference if we call WPA and CCC relief, or biological and agricultural and meteorological surveys research, or food stamp plans distribution of surplus, or ash and garbage removal municipal services. They are all, in the contemporary world, part of the total economic process. For that matter, education may also be treated as an economic institution, and is, except for a negligible fraction, a governmental enterprise, and government, either directly or through subsidy, provides about half of the medical care in the United States. The immediate bureaucracy of the federal government includes over 1 million persons, double the number of a decade ago, but if we include the employees of state, county, and municipal governments, the Army, Navy, courts, prisons, the recipients of all types of relief, we find that already in the United States half or more of the entire population is dependent wholly, or in determining part, upon government for the means of living. An equally striking symptom of the altered weight of government in the economy as a whole is provided by the figures for new capital investment. The ability of capitalism to handle the problems of the economic process was shown perhaps most accurately by the always accumulating amounts of new capital investment, which indicated extensions of the capitalist economic area. During the past 7 or 8 years, however, new capital investment in private enterprise has been almost eliminated, the annual amounts totaling only a few hundreds of $1 million, while vast idle funds have piled up in the banks. This does not mean that new investment has not taken place. It has done so through government, and in state enterprise, where it is in effect measured by the increase in the national debt. Federal government investment during these years has totaled more than 5 times private investment, a plain enough signal where the economic future lies. Outright acquisition by government of rapidly increasing areas of the economy is, however, only one phase of the process. Still more striking, and far more extensive in range, is the widening control by government of more and more parts and features of the economy. Everyone is familiar with this control, administered by the long list of commissions and bureaus and alphabetical agencies. There is control, to one or another extent, of agriculture and security issues, advertising and marketing practices, labor relations and utility rates, exports and imports, wages and banking rules. In this matter of control without full ownership, also, the United States is far behind every other great nation, but even in the United States it has gone a long distance, and there is every reason to expect a vast speed-up during the next immediate period. Nearly every one of these governmental controls imposes restrictions upon capitalist property rights, removes the objects and functions controlled to a greater or less degree from the unmixed reign of the market and capitalist property relations. The actual, day-by-day direction of the process is owned and operated by the government or controlled, without full ownership, by the government is in the hands of individuals strictly comparable to those whom we have called managers in the case of private industry, the men of the innumerable bureaus and commissions and agencies, not often the publicly known figures, who may be decorative politicians, but the ones who actually do the directing work. In government enterprise, we have, in fact, the development outlined in the preceding chapter. Groups 3 and 4, the finance capitalists and the stockholders, disappear, and Group 2, with the executive functions stripped of profit-making, merges into the managerial Group 1. Direction is not in the hands of capitalists, nor does a directing position depend upon the possession of capitalist property rights in the instruments of production involved. Under present conditions in the United States it is true that the governmental managers do not have altogether free rein, but the process of the extension of governmental ownership and control nevertheless means a continuous increase of managerial dominance in the economy as a whole. A clear witness to the truth of this last observation is provided by the growth in the number of bright young men, of trained and educated and ambitious youth, who set out for careers in the government, not as politicians in the old sense, but as managers in the various agencies and bureaus in all the myriad fields where they now operate. A generation ago these young men would almost all have been headed for private enterprise, with the goal of making a name for themselves in business, industry, or finance, and perhaps of finding a place in the charmed ranks of the upper bourgeoisie. More and more of them understand now that security, power, or simply the chance to exercise their talents are not to be found in the old ways but must be sought elsewhere. The young men thinking and acting in this way include, significantly enough, many of the children of the capitalists themselves, who perhaps sense that the dominion exercised by their parents as capitalists can be continued by the children only through giving up capitalism. I have been presenting so far only one side of this process, the process whereby, within the still existing structure of capitalist society, ever greater percentages of the economy are getting wholly or partly out of control by the capitalists and subjection to capitalist relations, and coming under the control of new groups and new relations, in particular of the managers and relations suitable to the social dominion of the managers. Capitalists and capitalist relations do not, however, simply evaporate in the face of this process. They resist it, and, when resistance at any point gives way, try to turn what has happened to their own advantage. In the next chapter, we shall consider, among other things, why in the long run this resistance and the capitalist attempt to make use of the process will break down. Here it remains to sum up once more the general meaning of the process. Marx once wrote that the basis of bourgeois domination was first built up within the womb of the old, feudal, society. Thus, when the great political tests of war and revolution came, the battle was really decided in advance. The capitalists and capitalist relations had won out in the preparatory period. We have seen that the inability of the proletariat and the propertyless masses generally to build up in an analogous manner social dominion within the womb of capitalist society is one of the crucial reasons why socialism will not succeed capitalism. However, disintegration of the social domination, that is, control over the instruments of production, of the capitalists is nevertheless going on within the very womb of capitalism, and domination by new groups, above all by the managers, is growing. On the world arena, which is the arena of modern society, the percentage of the economy controlled, as well as the completeness of the control, by the capitalists and capitalist social relations are alike diminishing at a rate which has rapidly increased since the First World War. It is the managers, with their allied or to-be allied political associates, who are taking up the control as it slips from the capitalist grasp. This is not a shift scheduled for tomorrow. It began yesterday, continues today, and the only element of prediction lies in expecting it to be completed tomorrow. The social revolution of today is not the revolution of the end of the Middle Ages, of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. There is no identity between what happens now and what happened then. But the decisive analogies between the two transition processes are just. The past in this case is able to teach us, if we wish to learn, what is happening and what is going to happen. Chapter 9. The Economy of Managerial Society. In the last chapter I held that the extension of governmental, state, ownership and control, an extension no one could possibly deny, nor, especially if we are considering world economy, expect to be anything but speeded in the future, was, in its historical meaning, a decrease in capitalist ownership and control. This development is, in turn, part of the general process of social transition which is taking place, a process analogous to what happened in the transition from feudal to capitalist society. Through this process, the rate of which is markedly accelerated by war and revolution, I maintain that the position of the capitalists as the ruling class in society is being undermined and, before long, will collapse. There are many who will agree with this interpretation of the growth of governmental ownership and control. Marxists, however, particularly Marxists of the Leninist wing, now represented by Stalinists and Trotskyists, will deny it, as will also, for very different reasons, many of the New Dealer type in this and other countries, who claim, when their own advocacy of the extension of government ownership and control is challenged, that, far from destroying capitalism, it helps preserve it. I wish to analyze here the argument of the Leninists. The contemporary state, say the Leninists, is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, the political agency for enforcing the capitalist rule of society. Therefore, when this state takes over some branch of the economy, or establishes economic controls, capitalist rule is in no way weakened, it is the capitalist's own state which does the taking over. On the contrary, capitalist rule is usually strengthened thereby. Nothing could be simpler than this supposed demonstration. However, the whole show is given away when we compare the argument with a basic policy that is always also held by Leninists, as by all Marxists, the policy, namely, of advocating at all times that the government shall take over any and all parts of the economy. Leninists, it is true, likewise say that what they want is a new government, a new state, which will be not the present capitalist state but a workers' state, and that government ownership will not really be in the interests of the masses and of socialism until such a new state is set up. It would seem, then, that they ought to wait for the arrival of such a workers' government before advocating government ownership and control. But this is not the case. They advocate that the present government, the executive committee of the capitalists, take over ownership and control. That is, they advocate what is, according to their ostensible theory, a measure which in no way weakens but on the contrary usually strengthens the social rule and domination of the capitalists and of capitalist social relations. In this case as in so many others, practical politics are a better touchstone than theory. The truth is that the practical step of extending government ownership and control acts, in its longer-term effects, to weaken and finally do away with capitalism and capitalist rule. Leninists are against capitalism, and they act consistently, even if they do not think consistently, by advocating on all occasions this practical step. It would be forbidden by a strict interpretation of their theory. But the theory is part of an ideology, ideologies are not subject to the canons of science and logic, and with the help of dialectics which are from one point of view simply a device for reconciling theoretical contradictions with the dictates of practice, the theory is adapted to the practical need. In this respect the Leninists are the exact converse of the capitalists, and the attitude of the capitalists is no less revealing. 99 times out of 100, the overwhelming majority of capitalists are, at the outset, against any and every extension of governmental ownership and control of the economy. They speak, write, and act against it, and get others, teachers, editors, ministers, to speak, write, and act against it. When it comes anyway, they adapt themselves, or try to adapt themselves, to it, but they oppose its coming. Capitalists are for capitalism, and their practical policy, whatever theories accompany it, follows from their position and interests. They are against the extension of governmental ownership and control because, like the Leninists, they rightly sense that, in the long run if not at once, it is anti-capitalist in its historical effects. The historically anti-capitalist nature of the extension of governmental ownership and control is the only basis from which we can plausibly explain the attitude of the capitalists themselves. Leninists are forced to the most complex and devious psychological fairy tales to get around the difficulties. When the capitalists, almost en masse, object, say, to some New Deal extension of the government into the economy, the Leninists are compelled to say that the capitalists, with their complaints, are only trying to deceive the people or are deceiving themselves about their own best interests. Such explanations are logically possible but most unlikely, especially when there is a simpler one that fits the facts directly. The capitalists object because the measures are against their interests. Let us examine more carefully what happens. We have already discussed the sense in which the Leninist theory of the state is correct, the sense in which it is permissible to speak, with proper caution, of the state in modern capitalist society as a capitalist state, as the state of the capitalists. Fundamentally this need mean only, though it may mean more than this, that, on the whole, most of the time and on the most decisive occasions, the state acts, through laws, courts, police, and so on, to uphold the general framework of capitalist social and economic relations. This is all that is necessary for the preservation of capitalism, since, given those relations, capitalism continues and the capitalists continue as the ruling class. When the state acts to enforce contracts or debt payments or to stop sit-down strikes, which negate the capitalist control of access to the instruments of production, the state may be described, somewhat metaphorically, as the executive committee of the capitalists. There is little doubt that the government, state, of the United States has been and may still be correctly described as a capitalist state. But we have also seen that, when the government takes over, either in full ownership or in some degree of control, some section of the economy, by that very fact that section of the economy is removed, entirely or partly, from the reign of capitalist economic relations. That section of the economy is no longer in the full capitalist sense a profit-making institution, with the profits going in one way or another to individuals who have one or another form of property right in the given institution. The products, goods or services, of the state institution are not subject to the laws of the market. They are not even, or do not need to be, commodities in the capitalist sense. Nor is the distribution of these products determined by capitalist property relations. This is why most capitalists invariably oppose such acquisitions by the government. The situation here is entirely different from what it is when the government acts in the limited political sphere which is proper to a well-behaved capitalist government. When the government exercises police power, raises or lowers tariffs, goes to war or stays at peace, convicts or acquits a capitalist for some private economic offense, some, perhaps most, capitalists will object, others will approve, but none will raise a question of principle, and there will seldom be a unified capitalist opinion on the matter. The measures may hurt some given group of capitalists and benefit others, may even hurt all capitalists, but they do not abridge the basic rights of property, control of access to the instruments of production and preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of those instruments, and they are consequently incidental to the main question of social structure and rule. The direct economic incursions of the government do, precisely, abridge or even eliminate those rights with reference to the section of the economy in question. They are therefore intolerable, so far as they go, incompatible with capitalism. The capitalists oppose the economic incursions at the outset. When, nevertheless, for whatever reason, the incursions take place, the matter is not then ended. The capitalists, though they have lost ground, try to turn the loss to their advantage, and they are aided in the attempt because the government remains, on the whole, capitalist. For example, the government, through PWA or WPA or some similar agency, begins to build schools and apartments and roads and bridges. To the extent that this is fully a governmental enterprise, it is out of the capitalist economy, and running it is not yielding capitalist profits to individual capitalists. But the capitalists can still turn it to capitalist advantage by supplying the materials that are used for the building, the materials still being turned out by capitalist enterprises, by selling the relief workers food and clothes paid for by the government wages, or by making profits from subcontracting where the government does not directly operate the work. The TVA can make electricity as a state enterprise, but, once made, a private capitalist concern can distribute the current, or a private capitalist factory can be built in the district to use its cheap rates. Again, it often happens that the section of the economy which the government takes over is one that private capitalists can no longer run except at a loss. The governmental incursion in such a case gets rid of the loss suffered by the individual capitalists, which is possible, if for no other reason, because the government does not have to run at a profit. Considerations such as these would seem to justify the Leninists, their theory, not their practice. Governmental incursions into the economy seem, in their light, not to weaken but usually to improve the position of the capitalists and of capitalism. This impression, however, disappears as soon as we turn from the frequent immediate effects to the full historical implications of the process. The capitalists, for a long time, are able to make up for each separate loss, even often to seem to gain after it, but they do so only by exhausting their own resources. They operate further and further from shore, but meanwhile their own base is progressively narrowed. It is like a poker player, with a great pile of chips, covering and raising each bet of his opponent. The opponent meanwhile is getting his chips by sneaking them from the bottom of our player's pile. When the pile is big, the game can go on for a long time, but in the end there is no doubt about the victor. Put it this way, the capitalists, as a class, base their power and privilege, their social dominion, on their control, ownership, of private enterprise, which alone is capitalist enterprise proper, since in it alone do we find the characteristic capitalist social and economic relations. So long as government enters, either not at all or comparatively little, into the economy, and at the same time is either tolerant toward or the active defender of capitalist relations, the social rule of the capitalists and the continuance of capitalist society is assured and often immensely aided by government. Even when government takes over substantial but still minor percentages of the economy, either through outright ownership or growing but not complete control, the social rule of the capitalists can be continued, and government can still act primarily to their benefit. The capitalists will not benefit directly from governmental enterprise. But, having private enterprise as a base for leverage, governmental enterprise can be indirectly manipulated to benefit private enterprise and thus the capitalists. This is simple enough when the relative percentage of governmental enterprise is low and that of private enterprise correspondingly high. Private enterprise then easily outweighs governmental. But, especially since the First World War, the universal tendency, in the world economy as a whole and in that of each separate nation, is toward the relative extension of governmental enterprise at the expense, necessarily, of private. Once again I must stress that such an extension is marked as much or even more by an increase in governmental control as by formal government ownership. Since control is the decisive factor in ownership, this extension takes place continuously and progressively, just as the relative extension of bourgeois is against feudal control at the transition between the Middle Ages and modern times. The rate of the process is enormously speeded at certain points as in Russia in 1918, in Germany from 1933 on, and everywhere by the effects of the Second World War. The base of capitalist leverage is undermined, the relative weights of governmental and private enterprise alter. When, finally, the major part of the instruments of production come under governmental ownership and control, the transition is, in its fundamentals, completed. The limited state of capitalism is replaced by the unlimited managerial state. Capitalist society exists no longer or lingers only as a temporary remnant. Managerial society has taken its place. The basis of the economic structure of managerial society is governmental, state, ownership and control of the major instruments of production. On a world scale, the transition to this economic structure is well advanced. All the evidence at our disposal indicates that the development will continue, in fact, proceed at a rate much speedier in the future than that of the past, and that the transition will be completed. We may not like this prospect, we may most bitterly resent it. But to think that it is not the most probable outcome is to judge history in terms of our desires and not of the evidence amply before us. What kind of economy will this be? What will be the specific economic relations within it? What group, if any, within it will hold most power and privilege, will be the ruling class? It would be foolish to pretend that these questions can be answered in minute detail. The science of history does not, or should not, lay claim to the precision of physics. Nevertheless, sufficiently meaningful and accurate broad answers can be given. These answers need not be imaginative speculation. We have evidence, considerable evidence, upon which to base them, the experiences, namely, of what has already happened in the transition period. The past, after all, is the only source of knowledge about the future. In contemplating an economic organization of society through state ownership of the major instruments of production, other writers have sometimes referred to it as state capitalism or state socialism. I certainly wish at all costs to avoid disputes over words. Though I call it the managerial economy of managerial society, I am perfectly willing to substitute any terms whatever, so long as there can be a common understanding of what is being talked about. However, as I wish now to show, the terms state capitalism and state socialism, it is ironic that both are used, are misleading in the extreme. If by capitalist economy we mean, as we do mean, the economic structure which has prevailed from the end of feudal economy until recent years, there is no sufficient resemblance in any important aspect that would justify calling an economy of state ownership capitalist. With this point, without further argument, I am sure that at least all capitalists would agree. Apart from the absence of all those other features of capitalist economy discussed in Chapter 2, you cannot call an economy of state ownership capitalist, because in it there are no capitalists. A capitalist is one who, as an individual, has ownership interest in the instruments of production, who, as an individual, employs workers, pays them wages, and is entitled to the products of their labor. Where could, such individuals be found in a state economy? Ownership would be vested in the state as an institution, not in individuals. Men would work for the state as an institution, not for individuals. The state would control the products of their labor, not individuals. No individual with money would be able to use that money for capital to start a business and make a profit out of that business. What sense could there be in calling such a condition of affairs capitalist? The term state capitalism seems to be due to a misunderstanding which we have already analyzed. When the state owns only a part, and a minor part, of the economy, with the rest of the economy remaining capitalist private enterprise, we might correctly speak of state capitalism in connection with that minor state-owned part, since, as we have seen, the economy remains in its balance capitalist and even the state-owned part may be directed primarily to the benefit of the capitalist part. But the capitalism in state capitalism is derived not from the state-controlled part of the economy but from the capitalist-controlled part. When the latter disappears, or becomes negligible, then the capitalism has disappeared. There is no paradox in saying that 10 times 10% state capitalism, far from equaling 100% capitalism, equals 0% capitalism. The multiplication is of state, not of capitalism. Though the mathematics would be much more complex, it would be nearer an analogy to say that, just as 10% state capitalist economy equals only 90% capitalist economy, so 100%, or even 80% or 70%, state economy would have eliminated capitalism altogether. But it is equally deceptive to speak of state socialism. According to traditional and historical usage, socialism means, so far as economic structure goes, an economically classless society. An economically classless society, as we have discussed, is a society in which no group of men, by virtue of special social or economic relations, has any special rights of ownership in the instruments of production, that is, any special degree of control over those instruments or any special preference in the distribution of their products. A state-owned economy might be economically classless. There is no logical impossibility in its being so. But there is not the slightest reason for believing that the particular form of state-owned economy now in the process of development will be economically classless. For a state-owned economy to be economically classless, a situation along the following lines would have to exist: ownership of the instruments of production would be vested in the state. But control over the state, and thus, indirectly, over what the state controlled, would have to be vested in everyone alike. No group or class in society would have any special advantages against other groups or classes in controlling the state. This situation, it must be noted, would have to hold on a world scale. The natives of China, India, Africa, and central Brazil would have to have, with respect to control of state institutions, a position just as favorable as that of the inhabitants of the industrialized metropolitan centers. Any important deviation from this world group equality would constitute the more favored group or groups of privileged or ruling class. It is not my intention to discuss the reasons why such a situation has no likelihood of coming about within the discernible future. At the very least, it would presuppose the presence of a superabundance of material and cultural goods for everyone in the world such as no one could sensibly expect for an indefinitely long time to come, especially when we remember that, as more goods become available, population increases, and more needs and wants arise. Needs and wants are infinitely expansible, a general moral attitude of cooperation and self-abnegation such as no social groups have ever in history been observed to display, and a degree of intelligence, scientific knowledge, and education for everyone that can seem realistic to expect only in a daydream. But it is not necessary to agree on the reasons. We have experiences of state ownership, in varying scales, to go by as well as the conclusions from the general economic trends which we have surveyed. They show us what we may justifiably expect. They prove that, though a state-owned economy might be classless, the form of state-owned economy which is now developing is, in fact, not classless and not going to be classless. There will not be a capitalist ruling class, there could not be, but there will be a ruling class. The privileged will not be bourgeois, but there will be those with privilege and those without. Nevertheless, it may still turn out that the new form of economy will be called socialist. In those nations, Russia and Germany, which have advanced furthest toward the new economy, socialism or national socialism is the term ordinarily used. The motivation for this terminology is not, naturally, the wish for scientific clarity but just the opposite. The word socialism is used for ideological purposes in order to manipulate the favorable mass emotions attached to the historic socialist ideal of a free, classless, and international society and to hide the fact that the managerial economy is in actuality the basis for a new kind of exploiting, class society. If the new rulers continue their present verbal usage, a book like this one is not going to change the linguistic outcome. For scientific purposes, however, the necessity remains to distinguish clearly the new economy, whatever it may be called, from the projected economy which was part of the traditional socialist ideal. There is not a trace of a magic in the structure of state ownership which could in some mysterious and necessary way eliminate class rule and domination. On the contrary, and this is not a question of speculation but already shown by historical experience, an economy of state ownership can, though it need not, provide the basis for domination and exploitation by a ruling class of an extremity and absoluteness never before known. Those who control the state, those whose interests are primarily served by the state, are the ruling class under the structure of state-owned economy. Through the state, they will control access to the instruments of production. Through the state, they will control the distribution of the products of those instruments so that they themselves receive the privileged share. This ruling class, as what has happened in the past few decades already makes clear, will be, or at any rate its decisive section will be, those whom I have called the managers. The managerial economy will be, thus, an exploiting economy. Here we must stop for a moment on the word exploit. This word is often used in a moral or psychological rather than a mere neutral historical and economic sense. For example, a bad employer who pays his workers sweatshop wages is said to exploit his workers, whereas a good employer who pays union wages does not. As the word is used in this book, there is no moral or psychological reference of any kind. By an exploiting economy is meant simply an economy wherein one group receives a relatively larger share of the products of the economy than another. By exploitation is meant the processes, whatever they may be, whereby such an unequal distribution comes about, independently of any moral judgment or of the psychological motives of the individuals concerned. According to this definition, all class economies are exploiting, feudal and capitalist economies are exploiting, and the managerial economy will be exploiting. The specific processes whereby exploitation takes place will not, of course, be the same as in capitalist, or feudal, society. No individual will be able to make money, profits, by using money as private capital in economic enterprise. Capital, so far as it would be proper to use the term, will be supplied entirely, or almost entirely, through the state. Control over the instruments of production will be exercised by the managers through their de facto control of the state institutions, through the managers themselves occupying the key directing positions in the unlimited state which, in managerial society, will be a fused political economic apparatus. Their preferential treatment and distribution will be allotted to them in terms of status in the political economic structure, not in terms of the capitalist type of property rights, any more than of the feudal type. The experiences of Russia and Germany already show that this preferential treatment and distribution need not take an exclusively monetary form. The nominal monetary income of managers may be low, with privilege in the form of cars, houses, food and clothing, luxuries, and so on, being granted direct for services to the state. It is the fact of preferential distribution that counts, not the form it takes or the means by which it is carried out. In capitalist economy, preferential income distribution to the capitalist takes place through the fact that the owners of the instruments of production retain the ownership rights in the products of those instruments. Since these products can be sold on the market at a price higher than the cost of the labor that goes into making them, there is a surplus, and a large surplus, for distribution on the basis of claims other than those for wage payments. According to capitalist practice, charges against this surplus are made in a great variety of forms, which obscure what is actually happening. Among these, however, such charges as interest, rent, dividends, bonuses, and high executive salaries assure the diversion to the capitalists of their preferential share in the national income. Under a completely state-owned economy, preferential distribution could not take place in the same manner as under capitalism. But there would be no difficulty in working out new methods of exploitation. Frida Utley, in her remarkable book on Russia, The Dream We Lost, has shown some of the devices which are at present used in that nation. One is, in effect, a gigantic food tax. The state buys from the peasants, at fixed prices, the food which is to be processed and sold to the rest of the population, in some cases, in processed form back to the peasants themselves. The state then, as the sole important distributor, sells the food to consumers, also at fixed prices. The spread between the prices can be as large as the traffic will bear. The second major device is made possible by the state's monopoly position in the production of non-agricultural goods and services. These also can be sold at fixed prices almost any percentage higher than the costs of production. Through the price spread in both instances, the state is left with enormous funds at its disposal. Some of these must be devoted to such always necessary social charges as depreciation, plant expansion, accepted social services, and so on. But the remainder can be so adjusted as to increase, relatively, the income of those who are actually controlling the state, the new ruling class. This is just what is done in Russia, and these two devices of exploitation are so simple and so easy, comparatively speaking, to control and manipulate that we may expect them to be very generally utilized in managerial economy. However, other equally effective devices can certainly be worked out. In fact, as the example of Germany, and of the New Deal, for that matter, is proving, more orthodox taxation methods are capable of very flexible use in redirecting income toward new channels, in violation of capitalist laws of profits and wages, even while capitalist relations remain nominally intact. The system of managerial economy might be called a type of corporate exploitation as opposed to the private exploitation of capitalism. It is by virtue of its functional status that the managing group exploits the rest of society. There are, as I have mentioned, partial analogies in other cultures, for example certain cultures where a priest group has been the ruling class. In some of these cultures, it was the corporate body of priests, acting as a group, which held social dominion. Rights of rule were not recognized as attaching to the individual as such. To a certain extent, the analogy would even hold for the medieval church. Qualifications for membership in the ruling priest group were of diverse kinds, sometimes blood relationship, but often abilities of various sorts such as supposed supernatural abilities as marked by visions, trances, or other abnormalities. Naturally, the existing priest group was able to control to a considerable extent the personnel of its recruited membership since the priest group had the reins of wealth, power, and education in its hands. There is a more limited analogy to be found in the Catholic Church's College of Cardinals, even today. The cardinals, by virtue of their status in the church hierarchy, have, as a corporate group, the right to elect a new pope, in whose office is vested sovereignty over the church as a whole. They do not possess this right, however, as individuals nor when acting as individuals. The right appertains to the corporate body, not to the separate individuals who make up this body. Within limits, the cardinals, with the help of their right and the powers which, as consequences, flow from it, can control the personnel of new members of the corporate body which they make up, and thus there can be, and is, a considerable human continuity in the makeup of the college. Similarly, the managers will exploit the rest of society as a corporate body, their rights belonging to them not as individuals but through the position of actual directing responsibility which they occupy. They, too, through the possession of privilege, power, and command of educational facilities, will be able to control, within limits, the personnel of the managerial recruits, and the ruling class of managers will thus achieve a certain continuity from generation to generation. An economic structure based upon state ownership of the major instruments of production provides the framework for the social domination of the managers. It must also be noticed that this apparently is the only economic structure through which the social domination of the managers can be consolidated. Within capitalist society, the power of the managers is, as we have seen, extended, both in private enterprise and through the growth of governmental enterprise. But this power is interfered with, limited by the capitalists and by capitalist economic relations. The manager is never secure. He can always be fired by someone or some group of persons possessing capitalist ownership rights. His plans for production must bow to the needs of a capitalist profit-dominated market. He is prevented from organizing the technical coordination of different branches of industry in an efficient way. Moreover, he finds the chief rewards going, not to himself and his fellow managers, but to the owners. We have seen that the managers cannot solve their problems by becoming themselves capitalists. Nor does any other type of private property right seem to offer solution. Certainly the resumption of feudal forms, which could be adjusted only to a predominantly agricultural economy, is impossible for modern economy, and chattel slavery would be no less impossible. Fusion of the economy with the state, expansion of the state functions to comprise also control of the economy, offers, whether or not the managers individually recognize it, the only available means, on the one hand for making the economic structure workable again after its capitalist breakdown, on the other for putting the managers in the position of ruling class. There are many millions of persons and many groups in the world today who consciously advocate state ownership of the instruments of production. They do so out of a variety of motives, some because they think it will bring a classless society and freedom, others because they think it will make possible universal material well-being, others from even more abstractly moral reasons. The attitude and actions of these persons and groups are one of the important social forces tending to bring about state ownership. Nevertheless, the result of state ownership does not depend upon the motives from which these persons advocate it. Under the given historical circumstances, the result will be not classlessness and freedom, not even universal material well-being, but a new form of exploiting, class society, managerial society. On the other hand, many, perhaps most, of the present managers do not consciously want or favor state ownership. Nevertheless, the managers, if not the individuals who are today managers, then those who will be tomorrow, will primarily benefit from it. We have here an irony that is often repeated in history. In the 16th century, many persons consciously wanted to get rid of the feudal lords and feudal exactions, to build strong national states, and so on. They wanted these things from diverse motives, a love of freedom, a wish for more material comforts, often from religious motives, a hatred and rejection of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, many of the capitalists of the time did not want these things. Their highest ambition was often to become feudal lords. They often were afraid that strong national states would interfere too much with the independent cities where their economic base had previously been. The majority of the great 16th century financiers and merchants of South Germany were good Catholics, and supported the Catholic Emperor and thus, indirectly, Rome in the religious wars. Nevertheless, the results, when won, in spite of motives, benefited primarily the capitalists, if not the individual capitalists who had taken part in the struggles, then other capitalists. Just so do the results of doing away with the capitalists, of establishing state ownership of the instruments of production, from whatever motives the aims are pursued, act to the primary benefit of the managers and toward the consolidation of a social structure in which the managers will be the ruling class. Many persons want state ownership and control, but the tendency toward state ownership and control is not by any means dependent exclusively on the fact that many people want it and deliberately work toward it. There are persons who want to revive feudalism, who would like socialism, No doubt even those who wish for chattel slavery, but actual conditions prevent their wants from having any chance of being realized. The circumstances, problems, and difficulties of the present, however, all combine to furnish soil on which state ownership and control grow rapidly. Private enterprise proves unable to keep the productive process going, the state therefore steps in. Modern total war demands the coordination of the economy. This can be done only through state control. Private investment dries up, state investment takes its place. Private enterprise fails to take care of the unemployed, the state gives them jobs. Foreign trade cannot be conducted successfully and profitably on a capitalist basis. The state establishes export and import controls and monopolies. Private enterprise can no longer handle the great projects, roads, dams, steamship lines, electrical plants, shipbuilding, required to keep contemporary society going. The state intervenes. There is nothing arbitrary about the extension of the state into the economy. It is not the result of a plot or a conspiracy. It seems to offer the only way of meeting the problems which actually arise, and consequently, however many may reject and oppose it, there are always some, and enough, ready to put it into practice. Though a detailed sketch of the managerial economy is impossible to give in advance, some of its features and some of its possibilities are already clear. We have seen that its structure is based upon the state ownership and control of the major instruments of production, with the state in turn controlled by, and acting in the primary interests of, the managers. This in turn means the disappearance of capitalist private property rights vested in individuals. From this structure it follows that it is no longer necessary for each branch of industry, or for industry as a whole, to operate at a profit in the capitalist sense. This will no doubt seem surprising or contradictory to those whose thinking on economic questions is determined exclusively by capitalist ideas. However, it is obvious enough when we reflect a little or consider the recent history of Russia and Germany. There is nothing in the nature of factories, mines, railroads, airplanes, radio transmitters that compels their operation to be dependent upon monetary profit. This dependence results merely from the specific economic relations of private enterprise, of capitalism. When these relations are gone, the need for profit is gone also. With the help of centralized state direction, managed currency, state foreign trade monopoly, compulsory labor, and prices and wages controlled independently of any free market competition, branches of the economy or the whole economy can be directed toward aims other than profit. The managerial economy is no longer the profit system. In managerial economy, the role of money will be considerably restricted as compared with its all-pervasive influence in capitalist economy. In the first place, money will no longer function as individual capital, which is its distinctive and decisive use in capitalist economy. But even in exchange transactions the use of money, as we have known it, will be limited. How far these limitations will go in the future we cannot say in advance, but we already are acquainted with some of them. Russia and Germany have shown how successfully foreign trade can be handled by a new type of barter method. It is argued by many economists that this barter method is clumsier and less efficient than the traditional capitalist methods which are dominated by the monetary aspect of the exchange, relatively free trading in currencies, and the help of gold to settle balances. This argument, however, holds only from a capitalist point of view. The barter method is clumsier, less workable, only if we are thinking in terms of capitalist economic relations. Actually, these same economists refute themselves, for they go on to show, correctly, that the controlled barter method can be competed with only by adopting the same method. If it were in reality an inferior method, it would not raise the slightest competitive problem. The United States, for example, would be only too delighted that other nations made use of it, because its inferiority would guarantee that the United States, sticking to the old ways, would without trouble win out internationally. As everyone knows, just the opposite is the case. Even in interior exchange transactions, the importance of money will decline. Where goods and services are supplied by the state without the consumers paying directly in money for each unit of them, money is necessarily functioning more modestly than where it appears directly in each transaction. Many of such goods and services have been present for some while: roads, bridges, public sanitation services, parks, scientific aids, water, and others. Russia and Germany show, what could be predicted in any case, that the field of these public services is to be vastly enlarged under managerial economy. An increasing number of consumer goods and of services will be supplied without the direct intervention of money payment, that is, an increasing percentage of real income will not take monetary form. Theoretically, there would seem to be no limit in this replacement of money. In practice, however, the convenience of money, and especially its convenience in maintaining differentials in income, seem to guarantee its survival. However, as, again, experience already shows, money will become increasingly and perhaps altogether divorced from any metallic base. The Fort Knox gold pile may well be turned into a monument for posterity, like the Egyptian pyramids. These developments in connection with money mean, from another point of view, that in managerial economy goods and services do not to such an extent or as fully as in the capitalist market function as commodities. Barter exchange, the allotment of goods and services without monetary intervention, both mean that the objects concerned are not treated simply as commodities, that is, as abstracted embodiments of so many units of exchange value, but as specific, qualitative entities fitted to serve certain needs and not others, independent, or partly independent, of exchange value. Just as the bourgeoisie, capitalists, will be eliminated in the managerial economy, so will the position of free workers, proletarians, as known under capitalism, be greatly altered. The freedom of proletarians under capitalism is, of course, a curious kind of freedom. It means, in the first place, freedom from ownership rights in the instruments of production. There will be no change in this freedom. Effective control of the instruments of production will be held not by workers but by the managers through their state. But proletarian freedom under capitalism also means, to a limited extent, freedom for the workers to sell their labor or not to sell it, though the alternative of not selling it, being starvation, is not too realistic, to sell it to one competing employer as against others, and to bargain over its price. These latter possibilities will not exist in anything like the same form under managerial economy. There being only one major employer, the state, there will be no bargaining among competing employers, and the assignment and transfer of jobs, as well as the fixing of rates of pay, will not be left to the accidents of market bargaining. There seems no reason to believe that managerial economy will be subject to the capitalist type of economic crisis, since the factors involved in this type of crisis, which are all related to the profit requirement of capitalist economy, will be done away with. However, it is most probable that managerial economy will have its own form of crisis. Managerial crises will, it would seem, be technical and political in character. They will result from breakdowns in bureaucratized administration when faced with, say, the complicated problems of sudden shifts to war or peace or abrupt technological changes, or from mass movements of dissatisfaction and revolt which, with the state and economy fused, would be automatically at once political and economic in character and effect. In managerial economy, the regulation of production will not be left to the automatic functioning of the market but will be carried out deliberately and consciously by groups of men, by the appropriate institutions of the unlimited managerial state. As we saw, the necessarily decentralized economy of private enterprise makes impossible such deliberate regulation of production as a whole. Under the centralized economic structure of managerial society, regulation, planning, is a matter of course. If we compare these features of managerial economy with our review, in Chapter 2, of the chief features of capitalist economy, we see at once that all of the leading characteristics of capitalist economy are either not present at all or present only in a drastically modified form in managerial economy. This fact reinforces the rejection of the term state capitalism. Managerial economy would not be going to replace capitalist economy unless it could solve, at least in some measure, those key difficulties, which we noticed in Chapter 3, that are faced by capitalism and make impossible the continuance of capitalism. We know, without waiting for the future, that managerial economy can do away with mass unemployment or reduce it to a negligible minimum. This was done, by managerial methods, in Russia and Germany at the same time that England, France, and the United States proved incapable of doing it by capitalist methods. The question here is not whether we approve of the way in which mass unemployment was or will be got rid of. We may think that unemployment is preferable to, for example, conscript labor battalions. Nevertheless, mass unemployment is the most intolerable of all the difficulties that any economy can face, sufficient, by itself, to guarantee the collapse of an economic system, and we are concerned with the fact, already sufficiently proved, that managerial methods and managerial economic relations can get rid of unemployment, whereas capitalist methods no longer can do so. The truth is that Russia, Germany, and Italy are not alone in having used the non-capitalist, managerial methods in handling unemployment. The CCC in this country is cut from the same pattern. Relief work in general is a half-hearted variant. If the United States had not resorted to such means, mass unemployment in this country would have been immeasurably worse and would already have sent the economic structure toppling. Under managerial economy, the long-term production curve can again resume its advance after the decline under dying capitalism. Indeed, during the past decade, if we accept small nations subject to special influences and without world economic significance, the degree to which nations have been able to build up a general production advance is closely correlated with the degree to which they have been transformed along managerial lines. Russia and Germany head the list of the great nations, the United States and France end it. Here, again, we are not concerned with what goods are produced, but with the volume of production relative to population and potential capacity. We may think that some of the goods produced, bombers and tanks, for instance, are not worth producing, are positively evil. We may think it is not progress to be able to produce more of them, but, nonetheless, the ability of one system of economy to produce relatively more goods than another system is a decisive indication of their relative survival value. Nor should we be so naive as to imagine that the structural and institutional relations which permit the production of a greater volume of armaments do not also permit the production of a greater volume of other types of goods. If it were really true, as so many say, that the Nazi economy were solely an armament economy, no one in the United States would be so worried, as all serious economists are worried, about Nazi economic competition after the war. Similarly, managerial economy is in a better position than capitalist economy to make use of new inventions and technological devices. It is not restricted by the same profit requirements that often mean a disruption of the capitalist market through a too sudden introduction of new inventions. This was not the least of the reasons why Nazi Germany was able to overcome, in part through the help of newly invented ersatz products, its seemingly hopeless inferiority in resources to France and England, and why Germany developed more and better fighting machines. Capitalist economy, we saw, is no longer able to use, for productive purposes in private enterprise, its own available capital funds. These idle funds will be no problem for managerial economy. The managerial state will either confiscate them, at once or gradually, or it will, for an interim period, compel their use on its own terms and for its own purposes. Managerial economy will be able to exploit and develop backward peoples and areas in a way that, as we found, is no longer possible for capitalist economy. Capitalism, though it needs to exploit these peoples for its own preservation, is at the same time no longer able to do so profitably. Managerial methods, both economic and political, free from capitalist profit requirements, reopen Asia and Africa and Latin America to a new exploiting era. Finally, as I have already mentioned, managerial economy, by virtue of centralized control of the economy as a whole, is able to plan for and with the economy as a whole in a way that is not possible for capitalist economy, with its system of divisive and uncoordinated control. There comes into being a 5-year or 2-year or 4-year or 10-year planning commission for the economy as a whole. Just as the very concept of such planning commissions is diametrically opposed to the individualistic ideologies of capitalism, so is the fact of their existence impossible for capitalism in any but a purely nominal sense. These last pages might seem to suggest that the managerial economy is about to usher in an age of plenty, sweetness, and light such that no man in his senses could do anything but welcome with rapture the prospect of the future. With all problems solved, milk and honey are apparently just around the corner. It is necessary to paint into this picture, which is, besides, only an economic picture so far, a few of the shadows. I am not dealing in this book, let me repeat, with questions of good or bad, of what ought to be or what we ought to do. I am trying to present a theory, a hypothesis, which seems to me more probable than any other on the evidence available, about what is going on in society and where it is leading. I have no intention whatever of judging, in this book, whether what is indicated by this theory is good or bad, whether the transition from capitalism to managerial society constitutes progress or not, whatever progress may mean. Moreover, even the apparently more modest question of whether managerial society will be more beneficial to men than capitalist society is in reality incapable of being answered. More beneficial in terms of what? To what men? When capitalism is finished, each man and each group of men necessarily loses both the distinctive goods and the distinctive evils that capitalism brought. A different organization of society will bring its own distinctive goods and its evils. It is not easy to know what evaluations men will make of what they have gained and lost. It does seem possible to make 2 points. Managerial society will bring no benefits to the capitalists as a class, unless extinction is a blessing, since there will be no capitalist class in managerial society. And, second, there is good reason to believe that under managerial economy there will be a greater total output of material goods in relation to the total population than under capitalism, including such goods as supply the needs of warmth, food, shelter, and so on. This would seem to indicate that the masses on the average, not necessarily any particular section of the masses, and the result is not guaranteed, would have a somewhat higher material standard of living. Whether this would be considered compensation for other facets of managerial society is, of course, a quite different question. That managerial society will, as I have stated, be able to solve certain of the major difficulties now faced by capitalism and incapable of solution under capitalism, seems to me highly probable. This does not, however, mean that managerial society will not have its own difficulties, including economic difficulties, and perhaps they will be judged more poignant than those of capitalism. I have already suggested that, though managerial economy will not be subject to the capitalist form of periodic crisis, it will have its own kind of crises. These may well be very devastating in their total social effects. Another group of the problems of the future emerges from the following consideration. Under managerial economy it will be possible to plan, to a considerable extent, the general process of production. This will be possible because control of the economic process will be centralized. There will be the institutional mechanisms for translating deliberate planning into action. Neither the centralization nor the mechanisms exist under capitalism, and deliberate planning is therefore not possible, or possible only to a minor and partial degree. But, contrary to a rather widespread popular misconception, there is no necessary social virtue in planning. Before the meaning of a plan is understood, we must know what the plan is for, what ends it is to serve. There is no such thing as a plan in and by itself. Just as many new inventions can be used equally well to kill men or to grow better food, so may there be plans for freeing humanity or for enslaving it further. A plan does not, of course, have to have one single and narrow aim. It may be directed simultaneously toward several aims, though it is quite possible that in such cases the different aims may interfere with each other. Unfortunately, we already know what 2 of the aims of managerial planning are: the more effective prosecution of war, and the support of the power and privilege of a new ruling class. There is no doubt that the ability to plan, which follows from the managerial structure, makes it easier to realize these aims, as well as other aims that may also be present. Theoretically, it is true, these aims might include greater happiness, security, and culture for mankind at large. Even within the managerial planning, there will be plenty of confusion. The rulers of managerial society do not really proceed scientifically any more than has any other ruling group. Their social aspirations are hidden by ideologies, not clarified by a genuine social science. The ideologies mask what is happening, not only from men generally, but from the rulers themselves. When a process is not subjected to scientific control, there is no systematic means for the elimination of errors, no rational device for the resolution of conflicts. Errors may accumulate into disasters, conflicts tend toward catastrophe. No matter how scientific the administration of managerial society were made, difficulties would still remain. Managerial society is a class society, a society in which there are the powerful and the weak, the privileged and the oppressed, the rulers and the ruled. If we base ourselves upon what we know from the past and not on dreams of other worlds, there is no reason to think that the law which decrees that all social groups of any size try to increase their relative power and privilege will be suspended in managerial society. Even if the attempt is in fact hopeless, it will still be made, directly or indirectly, openly or covertly. Put in the crudest way, there will continue to be, as there has always been in human history, fighting over the spoils. The fight may translate, and thereby partly hide itself into political and juridical, as well as physical, forms that we do not as yet suspect, but it will go on. And this is sufficient reason, if there were no others, why we should have as little faith in the promises of the ideologies of the managers, fascist or Leninist or Stalinist or New Dealer or technocratic, as we ought to have learned to have in those of the capitalists, when they tell us that following their pipe will guarantee a world of plenty and peace and freedom. The world of tomorrow will be very different from yesterday's, but if we choose to accept it, and most will accept it, whether or not they choose, there will be some satisfaction in doing so in terms of realities, not illusions. Chapter 10. The managers shift the locus of sovereignty. Any organized society patterns its life according to certain rules, customs, laws, decrees. These rules may not be written down, may not be explicitly formulated even in verbal terms, but they must exist or there would be no sense in calling the society organized. The origin of many of the rules, at any given moment, is lost in a remote past, but there must be within the society some mechanism for enforcing those taken over from the past, and, since the rules are always changing and being added to or dropped, for stating and enforcing new or changed rules. A social group which makes and enforces its own rules for itself, and does not recognize rules made for it by an agency outside the group, is called autonomous or sovereign, such as the capitalist nations all claim to be and the chief of them in fact were. The sovereignty of the group, by virtue of which rules are made, cannot, however, simply float in the group air. It must be localized, concretized, in some human institution which is accepted as the institution from which rules, in complex society called laws, come. In practice, this institution never includes all the members of the group. It might, for example, in a comparatively small and simple society, include all persons above a certain age meeting in council, but it would exclude at least infants. In complex and large societies, the institution is always relatively small, sometimes a single person, a king, for instance, who publishes laws as personal royal decrees. In large societies the situation is more complicated than might be suggested by the preceding paragraph. The particular institution, king or parliament or council of elders, where sovereignty is localized does not, in a broader sense, possess full sovereignty. Basic social power and privilege are possessed by the ruling class. The small institution is able to act as sovereign, to promulgate laws and have them enforced, not by virtue of the individual strength of its individual members, or member, but because, on the whole, it represents the interests of the ruling class and is, besides, able to gain acceptance or, at least, sufferance from a sufficient percentage of the population outside of the ruling class. Nevertheless, the question of the localization of sovereignty is by no means trivial in the history of societies. Some institution must be the public maker of the rules, the laws. Histories can be, and have been, written which center their attention on just this problem of where sovereignty is to be localized, and the many struggles which have as their political form the disputed claims to sovereignty of different institutions. History shows that there are many kinds of institution which can serve the social purpose of the localization of sovereignty. However, within any given type of society there are fairly strict limitations to the possible varieties. One of the most obvious and important of these limitations is technical. The sovereign body must be able to handle its work, at least not too badly. It is a technical limitation which excludes infants. Infants do not know enough to be lawmakers, even poor lawmakers, or which necessitates abandoning assemblies of all adults after a society gets beyond a certain size. There would be no place where they all could assemble, much less transact business if assembled. Moreover, a tribe that does nothing much else but hunt or fish has got to have a sovereign body that can handle at least those political problems that come up in connection with hunting or fishing. But there are different sorts of limitation as well. For instance, the sovereign body must have a certain appropriateness of form in terms of the patterns of social thought, the ideologies. If it does not, it will be hard for it to get publicly accepted as sovereign. Furthermore, a new type of society will almost certainly have a different type of sovereign institution from that in which sovereignty was localized in the preceding society. This follows because the old institution becomes, over a long period, hardened in the ways of the old society, not sufficiently flexible to readapt itself to the new, and because mass hatred is directed against the old institution as representative of the old order. Though this is the case, The institution where sovereignty is shifted will usually have existed in the old society, though not as the sovereign institution. What will be new will be its possession of sovereignty, not its existence. This tends to be the case because social institutions in actuality change slowly, cannot be built up artificially overnight, and because the institution to which sovereignty shifts really represents in the old society those forces tending toward the new. In an earlier chapter I have referred to the shift in the localization of sovereignty that occurred in connection with the transition from feudal to capitalist society. The result of this shift was to localize sovereignty more and more fully in parliaments, by whatever name they were, in different nations, called. History is not as tidy as a geometrical theorem. There is not a perfect equation between the development of capitalist society as a whole and the development of the sovereignty of parliament, but that there is a general correspondence, that in capitalist society sovereignty is typically localized in parliament, could hardly be denied. There is, certainly, a historical and structural propriety in this fact. Parliaments, the Commons or Third Estate only is in question here, existed in the late Middle Ages. They were simply the representative assemblies of the burgesses, the early capitalists, of the towns. They were called together, as infrequently as possible, by prince or king or great feudal lord, primarily when the prince wanted to get money from the burgesses, in return for which the burgesses would demand certain rights. Through this bargaining, the social power of the burgesses, and thus, on the political side, the sovereignty of their representative institutions, the parliaments, were built up. Historically there is no doubt about the status of parliaments as the typical political institution of the capitalists. In spite of changes and of the extension of the vote to sections of the population other than the capitalists, parliaments have retained the social marks of their origin. Constitutions, written and unwritten, and above all the control of basic power and privilege by the capitalists, have kept parliaments securely within the framework of capitalist society. But in makeup and structure also, Parliament has been a most appropriate institution for the localization of sovereignty under capitalism. Consider who are the members of parliaments. From the beginning probably a majority of them have been lawyers, that is, persons trained in the economic and juridical relations of capitalist society. They have been the kind of person you meet in businessmen's clubs, not clubs of the first rank, perhaps, but whose members are all the sounder and surer capitalist loyalists for the very reason of their second-rateness. In addition, there has been, especially in earlier days, a minority of powerful and brilliant political figures who identified the advance of their own political careers with the fate of capitalist society. These persons, the members of parliaments, met, discussed, and concluded in circumstances very similar to those of many gatherings of capitalists in the economic field. When we read descriptions of the 16th century meetings of parliaments, we cannot help being struck with the resemblance between them and the meetings of the bourses, exchanges, which were then starting in Antwerp and Lyons. The resemblance has continued. A law comes out of a parliament in a way not at all unlike that in which a price comes out of the bargaining on an exchange or other market. Moreover, these men who were the members of parliaments, and the parliamentary methods of conduct, were fitted, well enough, for doing the law and policymaking business of the limited capitalist state. This business, though often of the highest importance, did not as a rule need advanced technical, engineering or scientific training. Nor, except on rare occasions, was there much loss from the fact that the procedure was slow and cumbersome. In what the parliaments had to do, time out for party disputes, faction wrangling, speeches from dozens of persons, compromises and attempts at compromise, could usually be afforded. The economic process went on, in any case, at its own pace and under its own direction, largely outside the parliamentary province. States moved ponderously in their own element. It is no news to anyone to point out that during the generation since the First World War, sovereignty has been slipping away from parliaments. No development of this period is more obvious and indisputable, yet, for some reason, it has received far less attention than its unquestionably major importance deserves. It is a remarkable comment on men's unwillingness to face the facts of their own time that, though in recent decades hundreds of books and articles have been written on the history of how parliaments won sovereignty, there is scarcely a handful of serious studies of how, today, parliaments are losing it or of the implications of this loss. In 4 of the major nations of the modern world, Germany, Russia, Italy, France, sovereignty has already altogether departed from parliament, In 2, Japan and England, Parliament retains a small shred, and even in the last refuge, the United States, parliamentary, congressional plus Supreme Court, sovereignty is more than halfway into its grave. In Germany, Russia, Italy, and France, it is true that a parliament, in form, is retained as part of the state apparatus. These parliaments occasionally meet and even pass a few motions, unanimously, of course. But, even juridically, not to speak of de facto, these parliaments are no longer regarded as possessing the attribute of sovereignty. The rules, laws, for the societies do not issue from them. Their meetings are simply propaganda devices, like a parade or a radio and press campaign. Often the parliaments meet only to hear a speech or two, they provide a sounding board, in a ritualistic way symbolizing the nation. Sometimes they take a vote approving or accepting the speech. But they never initiate any measure, their acceptance is always of something already done by another agency. However, even this nominal, ex post facto acceptance is rare. The parliaments take no part of any kind in almost all the actions of the regimes. The example of Russia is particularly instructive, because revolutionary Russia made an attempt to continue parliamentary sovereignty, not a sovereignty localized in the Duma, the parliament of the old regime, but in the Congress of Soviets, which was thought to be the fitting representative of the new order. The Congress of Soviets, in 1917, was made up of representatives of local Soviets which, in turn, were elected primarily by workers and peasants in the various local districts. In the Congress of Soviets which met at the beginning of November, 1917, the Bolshevik Party had a majority. This Congress then declared itself to be the government, that is to say, it claimed sovereignty and declared that sovereignty was no longer possessed by the Kerensky government which was based upon the remnants of the old Duma. The Soviet Congress then proceeded to enact the chief initial measures of the new regime and to elect an executive, the Council of Commissars. It would seem, then, that sovereignty was still localized in a parliament, and, for a short time, this was more or less the case. But this state of affairs did not last. Parliamentary sovereignty proved inappropriate for a nation that rapidly developed in the direction of managerial society. Within a few years, well before the death of Lenin and the subsequent exile of Trotsky, the Soviet Congress had lost, one by one, all the attributes of sovereignty. Its nominal rehabilitation in the Stalinist Constitution of 1937 changed nothing and left the Soviet Congress the mere minor propaganda instrument which it continues to be. The development was indicated at least as early as the so-called Kronstadt Revolt, which took place in 1921. The opposition platform of the sailors and populace of the Kronstadt area had as its key plank, new elections to the Soviets. This demand was in reality an effort to return sovereignty to the Soviets and the Soviet Congress and an implicit recognition that these institutions no longer possessed sovereignty. The demand was rejected by the true sovereign institutions of the Soviet state, and the dissidents answered by armed suppression. I am not here raising any question about who was justified in this famous dispute, a problem which has been so hotly and so often debated. I mention the incident to bring out only the point that it revealed the loss of sovereignty by the Soviet Congress, that is, the parliament. In this shift of sovereignty away from parliament in Russia, which seems to have taken place without any very clear intentions on anyone's part, several important factors were involved. Experience shows that localization of sovereignty in parliament presupposes the existence of more than one legal political grouping, political party or some organized group comparable to a party. When there is more than one party, even if one of the parties is an overwhelming majority, parliament has always at least a minimum real function, since it provides a forum where the majority defends its policy against minority criticism. But where there is only one party, there is really nothing much left for parliament to do, and its political significance cannot be more than propagandistic. The politically significant body will be the controlling institution of the one political party, whatever that institution may be. The decisions of the party institution, when the one party monopolizes political life, complete the political job. The parliament can only reflect these decisions to whatever extent is thought propagandistically expedient. Even in this minor work, the parliament's sphere will dry up, since there is no use in merely having parliament duplicate tasks that are actually done elsewhere. From one point of view, and for certain types of activity, sovereignty shifts into the hands of the key party institutions. But this is not the whole story. We are not asking here who or what in some ultimate sense runs things in a society. As a matter of fact, as we have seen, in the more general sense things are run by and for the ruling class. Often in a society where sovereignty is localized in a parliament, the decisions later adopted by parliament are actually made by some institution of a firm majority party. Nevertheless, the phenomenon which I have called the localization of sovereignty is understood within a society, even if not by that name. Whoever may run things ultimately, some given institution or group of institutions is commonly recognized and accepted as the public lawmaker, the proclaimer of the rules for society. A political party or parties must work through this institution or group of institutions, at the least. In capitalist society, the typical institution of this sort is the parliament. We are asking what institution or group of institutions replaces parliament in this matter of the localization of sovereignty. We are not concerned here with where real power may be. History has shown the enormous symptomatic importance of shifts in the localization of sovereignty, and that is all that is necessary for our present purposes. In the case of Russia, as of Germany and Italy, the rules, regulations, laws, decrees, have more and more issued from an interconnected group of administrative boards, commissions, bureaus, or whatever other name may be used for comparable agencies. Sovereignty becomes, de facto and then de jure also, localized in these boards and bureaus. They become the publicly recognized and accepted lawmaking bodies of the new society. When you want to know what the law is, you look up the records not of Parliament but of a 4-year plan commission or commissariat of heavy industry or bureau for the colonies. Similarly, the place of committees of Parliament is filled by subcommissariats and subsidiary bureaus. Sovereignty has shifted from Parliament to the administrative bureaus. There are many who think that this development is the special result of the activities of communist and fascist politicians who by means of subversive activities have overthrown the old parliamentary order. As soon as we turn our eyes back to the United States, we should begin to realize the incompleteness of such a view. Exactly the same process has been going on in the United States as everywhere else, though it is today at a different stage from that reached in Russia or Germany. This fact is enough to show that the process has deeper historical roots than the deliberate schemes of revolutionaries. In the United States, sovereignty may still be chiefly located in Congress, together with the Supreme Court. It may still be the principal lawmaking body, but no one with eyes open during the past generation and especially the past decade will believe that its claims are today undisputed. Laws today in the United States, in fact most laws, are not being made any longer by Congress, but by the NLRB, SEC, ICC, AAA, TVA, FTC, FCC, the Office of Production Management, what a revealing title, and the other leading executive agencies. How well lawyers know this to be the case. To keep up with contemporary law, it is the rulings and records of these agencies that they have chiefly to study. How plainly it is reflected in the enormous growth of the executive branch of the government, which is no longer simply executive but legislative and judicial as well, in comparison with that of the other two branches. Indeed, most of the important laws passed by Congress in recent years have been laws to give up some more of its sovereign powers to one or another agency largely outside of its control. The process is, naturally, not yet completed in the United States. Congress is not yet the same as Hitler's Reichstag or Stalin's Soviet Congress. But it has gone much further than Congress itself would be willing to realize. Congress still occasionally revolts, still now and then disciplines an administrative agency or even abolishes it, but these acts are like the petty tyrannies of an already close to powerless old man. Very little control over the state is actually, today, possessed by Congress. The last year has shown that even the question of making war, most crucial of all the attributes of sovereignty, is, in spite of the Constitution, in reality beyond the power of Congress. Wars, also, are no longer conducted according to the parliamentary code. In the new form of society, sovereignty is localized in administrative bureaus. They proclaim the rules, make the laws, issue the decrees. The shift from parliament to the bureaus occurs on a world scale. Viewed on a world scale, the battle is already over. The localization of sovereignty in parliament is ended save for a lingering remnant in England, where it may not last the next few months, in the United States, and certain of the lesser nations. There is no mystery in this shift. It can be correlated easily enough with the change in the character of the state's activities. Parliament was the sovereign body of the limited state of capitalism. The bureaus are the sovereign bodies of the unlimited state of managerial society. A state which is building roads and steel mills and houses and electric plants and shipyards, which is the biggest of all bankers and farmers and movie producers, which in the end is the corporate manager of all the major instruments of economic production, can hardly be run like the state which collected a few taxes, handled a leisurely diplomacy, and prosecuted offenders against the law. Nor can the same kind of men run it. The new agencies and new kinds of agency are formed to handle the new activities and extensions of activity. As these activities overbalance the old, sovereignty swings, also, over to the new agencies. If a state is running steel plants, this is a more influential activity than punishing murderers, and the institution directing the steel plants has more social weight than that which makes laws about murderers. In theory, even under these circumstances, the locus of sovereignty might remain in Parliament. Parliament might continue to exercise representative sovereignty rights with respect to the great issues of general policy, providing a basic guide for all the agencies and bureaus. But this, which might well prove awkward in any case, is ruled out in practice for other reasons. The shift in the locus of sovereignty is only a symbol of the shift in basic social relations, the shift from the rule of the capitalists to the rule of the managers. As has happened in the other comparable historical transitions, managerial society does away with the representative political institution of the old society, not merely because a new type of institution is technically better for the new society, but precisely because the old institution represents the old society. It becomes despised and hated, and the resentment of the masses is turned against it. Look at France in the early summer of 1940, psychologically, ideologically, it is not suited for the new rule. Equally important, the administrative bureaus have the same kind of general appropriateness for localizing managerial rule as the parliaments had for localizing capitalist rule. For that is the real significance of the shift in sovereignty toward the bureaus. It is simply one of the phases, in the field of political structure, of the transition from capitalist to managerial society. The old-line parliamentarians do not do well in the bureaus. One or two of them may be present, as figureheads, for decorative purposes. But the actual directing and administrative work of the bureaus is carried on by new men, a new type of men. It is, specifically, the managerial type, the type we noticed also when considering the structural developments in private enterprise. The active heads of the bureaus are the managers in government, the same, or nearly the same, in training, functions, skills, habits of thought as the managers in industry. Indeed, there is less and less distinction between the two. In Russia, managers in industry and managers in government are one and the same, since there is no, important, industry apart from government. In all countries, as government expands, it incorporates the tasks and fields which were before left to private industry. Moreover, even before the state has swallowed all of the economy, the way in which the new administrative agencies conduct their affairs is, by the nature of the case, close to the way in which the managers act elsewhere, certainly far closer than a parliament's way, which is at an opposite extreme from the manager's habits. In structure, mode of functioning and personnel, the administrative agency, board, or commission appears as the typical institution for the localization of sovereignty in managerial society, as Parliament did in capitalist society. It is clearly to the advantage of the managers that the localization of sovereignty should be shifted to the administrative bureaus. These institutions are of a sort with which the managers can most easily collaborate. In fact, these bureaus have, in their leading staffs, got to be peopled primarily by managers. It is a managerial function that the bureaus are performing. Thus the social rule of the managers as a class can be best assured when sovereignty is recognized as pertaining, de facto and to a considerable extent de jure as well, to the bureaus. The social position of the managers is buttressed in the bureaus both against the claims of the capitalists and also against the pressure of the masses, neither of which groups can function effectively through the bureaus. Here, as before in the case of government ownership, the practical attitude of the capitalists is most revealing. Just as, in their overwhelming majority, the capitalists oppose every extension of government ownership, so do they oppose the setting up of new bureaus, boards, and commissions or the extension of the powers of those already set up. They inspire a constant stream of propaganda against them, including a continual effort to belittle their accomplishments and to picture them as ridden with graft, red tape, and inefficiency compared with private business which, when it is true, as it usually is not, is most often so because the bureau work has been interfered with by private capitalists. Following the customary pattern, when the agencies are nonetheless set up and functioning, the private capitalists then try to keep control of their activities in order to benefit primarily themselves. So long as the transition is in its early stages, so long as the dominant sectors of the economy still are those of private enterprise, this can be done. But when the balance swings, when the greater amount of economic life is subject to the Bureau's control, the base of leverage is lost, the capitalist's vantage point is undermined, and the managers through the Bureau swing into dominance. For just as the capitalists cannot continue as the ruling class, cannot continue even to exist, under a system of state ownership and control of the economy, so they cannot rule through a structure where sovereignty is localized primarily in the bureaus. It would, I think, be difficult to exaggerate the significance of this shift in the localization of sovereignty. It is, perhaps, a secondary phenomenon in the entire social revolution through which we are going. But it is a secondary phenomenon of a symptomatic character. Just as, in the case of the outward and evident symptoms of so many diseases, the nature of the disease is most plainly grasped by observing the symptom, minor in itself, so does this historical symptom reveal plainly to us the nature of the social revolution we are studying.